Welcome back to the Talk Past podcast. I am, of course, the host, NC, and today I have a guest from the festival we do.
Howdy, hey. My name is Zack. I go by Dark Rider on most media platforms like YouTube or even on Discord. So,
Indeed. And first and foremost, actually, before we get into the main topic of discussion, which is, of course, tiger claws, uh, Bagnak, etc., fist-loaded weapons in general that we've used and can discuss, I want to introduce you a little bit because I'm going to. It's going to be a little bit of an effort, but I would like to get all of us together that did those fight demos a while
Mhm.
back on the channel and sort of do like a commentary on them as best as we can for individual sake. So for people to kind of get an idea of who we are as both cast and crew for the channel, but what is your history with medieval history?
Yeah, with the medieval fair, it was definitely an experience for me when I still had like my first girlfriend. She was doing it, and then she got me like over to doing it, and then I thought it was a little interesting. I was just gonna be like part of the general cast. This was back 2014, if
Yeah.
I remember correctly, and it was a German and Magyar year. So I was just getting my you know putting my feet like in the pool, like just like in the shallow side, just to test the waters. And then after that year like went by, I decided, you know what, I'm gonna take it a step further, and then I joined the Fight Cast in 2015 for Scottish versus English for the War of Independence.
Fight combat. So you started in 2015. Did you do anything like some of us? Of course, Brandon, for reference, will scour the internet looking for fights to watch and sometimes emulate. Or some of us will look to like Star Wars or such. Or like Colin, who's kind of a regular on the podcast here, is kind of a history buff. Is there anything of that that you kind of brought to it or kind of found yourself? Like for me, I'm not really a big fan of medieval history. I prefer like prehistory, animals and whatnot. But doing medieval shows has kind of packed the books on top of me, and now I
Yeah.
kind of have that love of it as well. Is there anything that you kind of brought into it with that, or kind of it sort of attached to you?
I would say when after 2015, and then when I got my first feature fight against Dean, who was the artistic director, in 2016, like the following year. That's when I was becoming a little bit more comfortable with a lot of the fight stuff and all that. I mean, I was comfortable
Yeah,
at comfortable enough levels to be able to fight and produce like at least some quality there, and also to keep it safe, because obviously we do pride on keeping our fighters safe and making
of
sure that
course.
everybody is working to the top that they need to be. And but yeah, after 2016, and then I was able to keep it going like with consecutive feature fights that I get starting at 2017. I started to think a little bit more about what I could bring to the table, like something that isn't just what we like learn like on
like
during the
like like
rehearsals.
people that don't really take an interest, they just show up because they want to fight, which is still cool and it's still valid because we have some amazing fighters who are like that. But in terms of like engaging in the historical aspect too, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I think in terms of like the historical fighting, actually that's the funny thing is that with the 2016 fights and all that, I remember like because they always host like a little voting like for like what was the best feature fight
Yeah.
and all that in one of the matches, and in the second match where I was and all that, I actually voted specifically for like the Templar, or for Zack's another Zack
Yeah.
Templar character versus another guy who is the huntsman, specifically because of how they were fighting, like historically, what their skill sets provided, like what they would have done. It was like probably like the most realistic fight in my mind, just because it's like this is what you would get when you put a Templar up against some like peasant huntsman.
Right. Because I mean, for listeners who aren't engaged in, Renaissance or medieval festival or historical interests, course, so what we do technically is stage combat, but we do try to some degree, sprinkle or heavily salt a lot of Western medieval martial arts into what we do. So
Hmm.
there's sort of a varying degree of I'm moving the microphone. Oop, there. Varying degree of accuracy to what we do. I think I tried to implement that more in my later time as I became more interested in medieval history. But some people they like to do the WWE stuff, which is fine. That gets a lot of attention from the crowds. So it's a big crowd pleaser. And sometimes we get wrestlers that come to our show. But you also have like Dean, our artistic director that you mentioned, and Colin, of course, another guest here on the show, who likes to really engage in as historical as possible. Um,
Yeah.
what weapons do you own?
With the weapons I currently own, I know I have a sword. Um, that was, of course, something that I did have to get off of another cast member. Ultimately, I was able to purchase it from him, so it's pretty much now mine. I ended up getting a battle axe, or a two-handed axe. Um, I have a single-handed archer axe. Then my most recent purchase was a kukri, which again, it's one of those just like the Bagnak and all that. Like it's an Eastern weapon that may or may not have ever made its way like into Europe and all that. It's one of those that's like, yeah, this would be a weapon that most likely wouldn't show up and all that, but it's still like kind of one of those things that would be interesting to think about, like how somebody in Europe would have probably tried to fight with one of these.
Indeed, and then of course your leather bear claw that you have that you used
Yes,
for
those.
2018.
Yes, those the bear claws. I gotta say that definitely was the most interesting choice I ever decided to make as a character in 2018 when it was the Vikings and Saxons. Because again, like the likelihood of like a fist-loaded weapon, I mean, it's very possible. I imagine. I
Yeah,
just I wouldn't have ever expected it. But it was an interesting thing to think about and how to fight with those when I was on the Viking side. My
who did
character.
you who did you fight with those?
That would be Matt. Matt.
Indeed,
Um, can't think of his last name right now, but
numbers.
yeah, like I fought with Matt, who was the Saxon. He fought specifically with a sword and shield. For the first part of the feature fight, I was fighting with my single-handed axe, and then there's a point where I do throw it like at him, like as an attempt to basically see if I can land a throwing axe hit, and then of course easily dodging it. That's when the only weapon I had on hand was basically the bear claws, and at that
Right,
point I just had to start swinging away at him.
exactly. It's kind of like a quote from Buffy to transcend into a fantasy here. Spike referencing to Buffy. You have to pick up your weapon. I already have my weapon. Referencing, of course, vampire fangs. But in lieu of that, bear claws. Obviously, yours is strapped to you. It's like a glove, right? It's like basically like a
Yeah, it's
gauntlet.
kind of yeah, it's kind of like a gauntlet, like in the sense that it's like it's basically like a leather padded like piece that goes over like the top of my hand, and then the claws are like extended out basically with leather wrappings around the claws themselves. And basically it holds them together while there's like a couple of little leather straps that go on each individual finger, so that way I have at least a little bit more control over it.
What are the claws made of? The
Well,
claws themselves.
those, yeah, those in particular, I do not know. I mean, they kind of felt like they'd be a little bit plasticky or something like that. I mean, I
Okay.
wasn't too sure, but in the sense of how the show was and what I was trying to display is that maybe it was just like claws that you again like you would just take off of a bear like if you were strong enough to take on one, and that was my character's mentality, is that being his name Bjorn, which is you know uh, Danish, I think, for a bear.
Mhm.
And basically, yeah. He fights in the sense, or like he was supposed to fight in the sense that he was a bear. That even though Matt was a little taller than me, I still had to have that mentality that's like, I'm fighting him with basically my own claws, like my own claws, not my hands or anything like that. It's my claws.
Hmm. Exactly. Although, of course, you're a bit more built than Matt, and he
Yeah.
was using he was actually using a different weapon than he normally does. He normally uses a pole arm, which is much more historically accurate than using a sword as a main weapon. Of course, swords were like secondary defense weapons.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, that was a good fight. But on the topic of the bear claws, of course, I don't know if that's particularly, and we'll discuss a few of the other similarities that we have in terms of kind of teetering on the fantasy line. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's particularly historically accurate. Bear
No.
claws in the way that you wore them. But fist-loaded weapons, absolutely, and claw weapons, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because the particular because the claw weapons and all that, from what I understand, from what little research I did do just before this podcast, was that how they were mostly worn, they were kind of more like a concealed weapon and all that, not something that you put out and straight forward. Like the Bagnak, from what I understand, it's built up basically like tiger claws, but where the rings, there's like a couple of rings on each edge where you would put maybe like a pinky and like your index finger through and then kind of clasp the rest of the claw in. And then the claw would basically be sort of an extension, like kind of coming out a little bit between each of your individual fingers on the inside. So it's like if you go and like give somebody a handshake or something like that, then you could end up just clawing them, which I think that was the purpose behind it, like for at least most Indian assassins that tried using them, because they would poison the tip of those and then try to assassinate a target with those.
Right. So let's delve into fist-loaded weapons, and at least in the range of similarities to our use. What you reference, of course, the Bagnak, is a Hindu weapon, or Indian, as in India,
Mm-hmm.
which is also known as a tiger claw. Uh, for that visual that you gave, of course, you've got it's normally made of metal.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's like four prongs, and then you got the two outer rings, and then you wear it with the flat end of the claws against your palm, and then so it's kind of like raking like a tiger or a bear in your case. And I mean, there's some videos on YouTube of those being used on animal flesh, like dead pig, and trees, of course, and those can get pretty deep. I've did a lot of searching for some of these weapons, but to get an exact time period is very difficult. I think the most popular time frame for tiger claws themselves is based off of actually individuals that used them in the 1600s, which obviously is further out from the medieval period. But they
Yeah.
are also uh, they date back quite a while. But even still, it's a very simple, a very savage weapon. It's very hands-on, and I like that. I like being in measure and having weapons that are in measure. So
Yeah.
pretty much what you had was a modified Bagnak.
Yeah, in a sense. And of course, in my regard, whereas the Bagnak, like I said, and all that, it's more like because it's you typically, like most people I've seen that have held it, is usually within the inside of their palm. Mine was basically extended out from the knuckles. So I had to
Kind of.
think. So I had to think like when I'm fighting, that if I'm throwing my fist, I'm throwing them, but with the intention of like going into a slashing motion. Like it's not like I can't just simply like punch regularly with these things. Like these are not like a blunt weapon; they are a slashing weapon in that
So
sense.
so to get a better visual for those listeners and maybe others that have done our show or other shows that might be interested. So that's because obviously I've seen you fight with them. That's kind of more like if you want to think of a very intensely blunted Wolverine claw,
Yeah,
is what that is, with a leather, like a leather wrapping. There's actually a medieval weapon for the leather portion, and I've got that actually up here. Of course, I do not have it prepared in terms of the cestus. The cestus is just literally basically the gauntlet. It's basically a fingerless glove, right? But
Hmm.
it's varying different materials, usually leather strips that are wrapped, and then yours is effectively that, but with kind of like Wolverine claws that are just like the knuckles. If
Yeah,
Wolverine just had little middle knuckles, which is a lot more like the tekokage. And
yeah.
the tekokage, of course, another fistlet weapon, is more akin to exactly what Wolverine's claws are. Started off as farmer tools to dig up weeds in feudal Japan. Of course, feudal Japan is about 1100s to I think the 1600s. Yeah, exactly that. So feudal Japan, which is about 1100s to literally the turn of the 16th century, so 1600s, and that started out, like I said, as weeding, and then became tools as instead weapons for the shinobi, which of course is the modern concept of the ninja.
Mhm.
And that is a little bit more like what you have, except yours is blunted. Um, have you tested your bear claws out on anything? Like just to test them out or play with them?
Yeah, in terms of messing around with them, just seeing how they felt, I definitely figured like as weapons that they wouldn't be my ultimate means like to try and well to air quote kill somebody. If anything, they're definitely fielded as like kind of like a last resort. I mean, in terms of testing, I did like see how often they work, like hand in hand, like with whatever weapon I may actually be grasping a hold of. And at first I was like wondering if there was going to be any point like where the claws might collide with the spear that I ended up using after I go through a barrage of like swings towards Matt until eventually I claw at his around like the back of his shin. I can't remember exactly like the calf, I think it was.
Mhm.
But basically, when I claw that part, I basically have a chance to get away like real quick while he's just focused on his injury, and then I get my spear. And yeah, surprisingly, like when we worked in our fight from there, it actually they didn't really get in the way that much. Like they were actually staying in my hands perfectly, so that way, if by any chance I happen to lose the spear, or if Matt got in like past the range of my spear and got like close quarters with me, I could just rely on the claws to get him to back away, or otherwise take a swipe and tear some flesh off.
Yeah. I mean, yours is a lot more forgiving in terms of being a weapon that's more like a gauntlet that you can use other weapons with. So
Yeah,
of course, claws themselves probably wouldn't be the first main weapon anyway, because that's something where you're gonna have to force yourself to get into measure.
yeah.
Um, when I used the nekote, which is the iron claws or cat claws or those gothic looking finger claws that
Hmm.
goths tend to wear, which I again had looked up when they were kind of originated, but and now I'm not. That's out of my memory at this point. I tried looking it up again, but someone knows and could type down below. I know I looked it up long time ago. We did fight demos on the channel where we had basically an interactive fight series where
Oh yeah, yeah. I
you
actually do.
felt.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
actually do remember that. That was yeah, like with like the like tournament stuff and all
Yeah,
that. You
all the
had like something like where you eventually even like dipped one of those like into a potion, which would more than likely be a
poison. Yeah,
poison based thing and all that.
which
Which
is
again,
how. But
yeah, which again is like that's perfectly like what they would have been for his like because again like while like they could be good, if you're dealing with an opponent who is going to fight back with their own weapon, then yeah, you would have to give yourself an edge that you really needed, and most of the time, poison was the perfect thing because you at that point disorient them or they're otherwise slowly dying, whatever the case, you get a better chance at killing them before they kill you.
exactly, because there's not going to be a weapon that's going to, once you're in measure, something like, unless it's an intensely sharp Bagnak or Tikokagi that obviously can tear several inches through flesh. Uh, I am not gonna guess if how it could do leather or chainmail or plate or even padded armor because obviously it's not going to get through that. But flesh itself, uh, the nekote and your bear claws are definitely going to be more of something to help us get out of measure or poison the opponent. In those videos, those now I consider them fight demos because it was very much a guerrilla filming. It was very much us sort of exploring the idea of what this channel would like to be. And I'll release those videos again with commentary over them with the individuals that fought in them. But my use of the cat claws, or at least the cat claw, I only had one. I used a Viking Viking dagger, forged, should say, by BKS, and that was my main weapon against Tara, who's one of our absolute best fighters in the show. She used a axe. She used her axe against my dagger. So she had more range. She had more skill. She had more experience. She was far more fit for the fight than me. So eventually I lost the dagger. I think I stuck it in a tree, which was a big thing. I originally just stuck it in there just casually because we were in between takes. And then the tree bark fell or exploded, I should say. And Brandon was directing. I was fighting Tara, and we're like looking at the explosion of bark, and we're like, well, that could have been used. So we do that take again, where this time I just slam it into the tree to really dig it in there and explode the tree as best as possible. And then go into just using the claw. When she knocks me down, nekotes were used by the female shinobi. Of course, modern tense people know as ninjas. Think of Melina in Mortal Kombat 11 and Shang Tsung in Mortal Kombat 11 have nekote or leather claws in general. Usually they would dip them in poison. You do whatever and you go about your business and let the poison take its course. So for me, how my character used it is, I believe I scratched her in the face, which we had everything was campy. Everything about the videos. I tried to make it serious, right? But in Florida, you can only be as medieval accurate as possible. But,
all the palm trees
and guerrilla filming and all that stuff. So I'd like to eventually do that again, but more historical and cinematic than the way interactive way we did it. But like claw her face, which would create a scratch. If you had more, of course, it'd be a little bit more of a damage to them, a little bit more inflicting of poison than just my singular cat's claw ring, and I just disappeared. And then throughout the episode, it's her dealing with suddenly now she realizing that she's been infected with poison, and that was pretty much the use of those. I guess you could do that in the same vein with the bear claws, if you had them, because you mentioned possible like a sort of plasticky end to them. If you use actual bear claws, obviously I don't condone abusing bears, but if you can manage to find bear claws,
I think if it was more like I think in the sense of with weapons and all, because I mean again it's like the likelihood of like somebody like hunting a bear like to be able to use their claws for anything and all that. Even if somebody actually did like declaw like a bear like to be able to use like its claws like as a weapon, it wouldn't necessarily do them much good, even though they would be sharp and all that. I think it is the idea that they may have the tendency to just they may dull down a little bit easier because again, it's like, you know, the more you scratch at something, like then it's basically going to be like a little filer to them. and
Yeah,
there's not really any way to kind of like not any like good way to fix something that is technically in some sense a bone and all that. So
exactly.
it would be a lot easier like if there was somebody that was designing like maybe something where maybe a little lightweight, but something more metallic. Like, maybe like some iron that is like shapened into a claw, all that. I would think that that definitely would make the most sense. And again, you can always like sharpen like the blade or like the blades on them if they ever get dulled.
Exactly. Of course, in medieval Europe, they would have used iron, um, and a few others, but they were very crude metals. So it would have been probably very, very crude and very brutal. Kind of a savage weapon. Savage, I mean, as in very up close, very sort of wild, not in terms of any sort of culture. But
Uh,
yeah,
yeah,
no, like real bear claws would have been, you'd have had to hunt like a giant bear and then hope you win, right? Hope you
yeah,
win. And I mean, today we've got good ranged weapons. They did then too with arrows and such. And they had, of course, pole arms and swords. And I won't get into the deep dive of killing a bear. But
yeah.
I imagine if you tried to use a real bear claw, that'd be kind of a few and far between, very expensive.
Yes, I would think for sure, like in that regard, because again, like using something from an animal that may or may not be like rare depending on like the area and territory that you're in there would be quite a price for it, and even then it's just like the price technically really wouldn't be worth it as much. I mean, that's what was like funny about getting into the mentality of my character when he was using his bear claws, because I was thinking it as it from the perspective of if he was using just straight up bear claws, because it made the most, because if they were like anything like traditional iron or anything like that, if they were like sharpened to where they needed to be, then my character more than likely would have had the notion to just use those like once I threw the axe, and then just go for any kind of a point like where it's like the femoral artery or something like, because again those can go in deep. Those would be able to go in deep enough and nick, an important artery, and then just the opponent's done. Like they're just slowly dying at that point.
Of course, the weapons we're discussing are much more prevalent in China, the Japan, with the tekukagi and the nekote, specifically, of course, Japan, but also India with the
Mhm.
Bagnak. But it is not completely unreasonable, especially if any weapons that were from the 1100s and on, to make their way to medieval Western Europe, or even perhaps if there were any of those sort of weapons prior to encountering possible Vikings.
Yeah,
Because of course there's the spice trade. Spice trade is the road from, of course, your Indian spices, your spices from China and other European as well as Eastern countries, making it back to England and Ireland, Scotland, all the areas that we typically focus on, France, Germany. So it's not out of the realm of possibility.
yeah, and
I
especially
know.
because for the Vikings and all that, they were traders. That was like one of their biggest things too. Is like even though they were most known for their plundering and pillaging and all that, that a lot of the stuff that they would have gathered from that, they would have wanted to trade off for their economic purposes.
Indeed, I'm actually looking up um, Templars to see if they may have gone as far as that. I'm not sure. So
I
I'm not
don't. Yeah,
sure if
I don't think they technically gone like as far as I mean, because again, like there's with most research that we are doing in modern day right now, some people are coming up with some really interesting like places that Vikings may or may not have been a part of. Like I remember there was even a story where a Viking was possibly found in America or in one of the Americas.
same vein. If you're ever doing any traveling, because in terms of the spice trade specifically, you can imagine all sorts of different things being traded to and from, of course, the time that you used them, which is our Viking era time frame, the 900s, with Alfred and Guthrum,
Hmm.
the Saxons versus the Vikings. They did a lot of intertrading. So it's kind of ironic because the Saxons traded their better made weapons to the Vikings, and then the Vikings used those better made weapons on the Saxons. Whereas previously, the Vikings had much more cruder weapons and armor than the Saxons, and the Saxons were just, when able, of course, just taking them out. Vikings, of course, are depicted as more brutal, but in all honesty, what the Vikings did wasn't uncommon for literally any other culture to do the same thing.
Yeah.
They're just, I think they're heavily browbeaten by the media. And then when I mean media, I mean both current media, but also word of mouth. Alfred never would have said anything good about Vikings. Anyone fighting the Vikings never would have said anything positive about them or anything about them that would have struck them as clever, right? That's probably where we get all this barbarian nonsense from.
Yeah, I think that is the ironic thing too about just simply about like with when it comes to different cultures and the wars that they would have been waged, and then pretty much whoever won got to decide and write the history on what these people were like and all that. And
Like
most of the time,
Alfred said, he will write down how he wants history. I will make it known that Alfred sought peace, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, if you have the written language, which Vikings had their own, but it, it, you know, what language is more prevalent now? But
yeah,
but I can imagine that the Vikings, of course, Vikings doing a Viking, it's a job, not a group of people, but Scandinavians, of course. I can imagine they would be more receptive to using those kind of weapons of other cultures than perhaps the Saxons or any other kind of um, Judeo-Christian
yeah,
culture. And I can see the Vikings sort of taking things like the Bagnak and fist-loaded weapons and kind of running wild with them and
yeah,
sort of perfecting them. But I would like to look this up. I'd really like to deep dive, maybe find some books or try to get in touch with some historians and get them on the podcast here. Because some of the things we talk about that we use and we kind of scratched the surface of, it's very hard to find uh, solid or precise information about or more specific numbers. Like you can look up feudal Japan was a very specific time frame. You can look up medieval history was a very specific time frame. But can you find the invention of the sword, like the day, the time it was invented,
yeah.
sword was invented?
It's definitely one of those that's interesting when you think about like some of these foreign weapons that can always be a possible thing that you could see and all that. Because again, you never really know like what a person was fighting with back then. I mean, like the majority of what most people would have fought with back then would be things like spears, swords, axes, and depending on the time frame, a lot more people were using swords or a lot more people were starting to use like spears or something like that until eventually you know weapons started getting updated more and more until eventually we got like the gun or like the or until they I think it was the gunpowder when they started discovering or getting that because
It was
actually that was
China.
technically something that was eastern that would have been
Yeah,
brought to Europe.
yeah, that was China. And of course, the sword originated in 3300 BC in Turkey. Just like every single weapon that we've just talked about was previously a tool for something, whether it was weeding, like the Bagnak, Takagagi, and the nekote. The sword was a tool. Scorpion spear, of course, was a tool. Which we need to do a podcast episode about Mortal Kombat too. Um, everything was kind of a tool. Scythe, uh, and then became a weapon. So it's sometimes very difficult to deep dive these, and I'd really like to see if I can find some manuals that really delve into it, even if it's in languages that we don't have knowledge
Yeah,
of. You can always find translations and such. I've got the medieval manuscripts on our Discord, but that doesn't necessarily delve into the weapon history, which I would love to.
yeah,
But I mean, that's basically it for those weapons. They're very obvious, very simple, they're very specific use, and they're very in measure weapons. I used the nekote, at least a single one. Granted, mine is a gothic finger claw, but it is a very simple build. It's very just iron construct that's just your basic finger claw that goes over. For me, it's the ring finger because that's the only finger it fits on.
Yeah.
And it bends to the knuckles. It's got the claw that extends maybe an inch out from the finger, and it's blunted like most of our weapons. Some of our weapons, the people that blunt their weapons, but something like the Bagnak is a little more intense. That's something that's I think for us, it's I think for us for what we do, it would be harder to display because it's such a hidden weapon.
Yeah, I mean, again, because that was the point of the Bagnak was, it was very widely used by a lot of assassins when it came to like, political targets, because it was easy to just conceal like along like the cup of your hand, and then just
Exactly.
go up to somebody and just like slap. Because again, when we display our fighting, we usually go with what is big enough for people to see and be able to do with. I mean, that was the biggest challenge, I would say, in terms of medieval fare with the bear claws when I was using them,
Right.
because it's like I had to come up with moves that were big and wide enough so that way, in the very least, that even if I am doing somewhat fast movements, that people can see what's in my hands and why Matt is backing up, instead of just maybe trying to take some blows, like, oh, just so that way he can use his sword. It's like, because if he takes one swipe at those around his face area or anything like that, that could take out an eye, or even
Right.
worse, in his case, possibly even like get along his neck and cut the jugular, and that would pretty much end the fight right there.
Right. If they were like historically accurate, but even our blunted weapons, even weapons that are made of wood and stuff like that. What we do for the listeners that aren't part of our particular group, or particularly have been to a medieval or Renaissance fight show. Um, Maybe they have experience just watching like the YouTubers or just reading medieval history. What we do is very specifically theater in the rounds. It's a lot like wrestling. It's it's pretty much wrestling, but medieval wrestling, right? It's like Cactus Jack version of medieval fighting. I can only say Cactus Jack because Cactus was weapons. He always had chairs. He always had every kind of weapon under the sun on hand. And although we do hand-to-hand stuff, and we do actually do wrestling, both the in-ring professional wrestling, but also historical hand-to-hand combat, we mostly use weapons. A lot of what we do has to be obvious. It's theater. It's stage combat. If the crowd doesn't know what we're doing, then it's completely lost on them, and it's only for us to enjoy. Basically, it's just us playing with ourselves effectively. It's just not in the weird sense.
No,
Um,
makes sense.
Basically, playing with our toys, right? So obviously, it is a lot easier with the film that we did when we did the tournament show here on the channel, which I'm going to re-upload to the channel, like I said, with commentary. But just the fight portions instead of they were episodic and they were so campy. But you versus Dave was probably my favorite episode because it was so tight. It was so what we did is we pretty much did what we do in stage, but we tightened it up. We were allowed to, like medieval history would have been more historically accurate, have a more precise fight, because the fights back then wouldn't have been so grandiose, wouldn't have been so wide. You wouldn't have had to show the fact or embody the characteristics of a bear to show that you're using bear claws. You could have just used them as they were necessary, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah,
for me,
because during that time with Liam's character, because that was the character that I had,
yep.
Liam McCormick, the Irish mercenary of the it was the Glasgow mercenaries, I think it was.
Mhm.
But yeah, in that regard, he was fighting as somebody who was basically trained in, like, the way of the sword, in that regard, that he would be facing off against a corrupt priest. And even despite all that, I think that's one of my favorite things too. Is while we did showcase like a lot of the fighting, it's like you said, there was like a lot of the good, precise, moments of like seeing, just the precision of how I attack and how like he returns like with a counter or anything like that.
Right.
And up to the point where like even like when the fighting was done, like, or getting to the end, that you see a little historical precedence of what how much religion has also in terms of impact towards the people
Right.
back then. Because he throws the Bible at me, I mean quite literally, where I catch it because again, like, dude, like he's throwing something that's very sacred, like especially to someone like me.
Yeah.
And even though I have him at point, I'm looking at the Bible at some point, thinking like, well, if I do this, then who knows where I stand with God and all that, which leads to that whole little like who won moment at that point.
Exactly. Which, of course, I'd love to do another episode because this kind of falls into that category of improvised weapons. Because you guys actually use more than just. Dave used a leather book as a weapon.
Yeah,
Um, I think you had a sword, but you guys also used your fabric. He had a cape or cloak. He used his little cap. You had, as well as you had a bandana, which I think
yeah.
fell off at some point. Which
I
obviously, when you guys are actually fighting, is going to happen. So there's a lot of multi-weaponal, multi-weaponal, multi-weapons in that series, and we're going to eventually do that again more cinematically down the lines once I'm back down in Florida and once we have the time to just do it. Now that we have a field. But you were saying something. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah, and then back in reference to like with all the different like weapons that were just more than just simply like the typical weapons like the sword and like his iron, or I think it was like the iron cross or something like that, or
Silver
cross
swing.
hammer, I think it was. But
Yeah.
basically, yeah, which basically for those that were listening, basically it's like a typical priest's staff that has like the cross on it, but it's made of metal and sharpened at the tips to act like a type of spear, but yet also can be blunt as well, like if slamming down. And it also has a spear end at the bottom, so that
Oh
way it
yeah.
can act as like just a straightforward spear. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
pretty cool weapon for
I,
sure.
I need to get him on this to talk about that. That is a very specific weapon that is not historically accurate in any way, shape, or form.
No,
It's based on the idea of something historical, right? The halberd or pole arm, etc. But exactly as you described. Oh my goodness, I used that obviously in 2019. I was a preacher, which was very controversial. But uh,
the
but
South Baptist.
yeah, I'm not going to deep dive that, but I did that because it just felt so natural for the
Yeah.
character I was doing. And then Dean was like, "You're gonna speak English when we do the show, right?" I'm like, "Oh, really? Nobody said anything until the week before. I was really hoping no one said anything."
Yeah.
And
But
then, and then,
ultimately, yeah, ultimately you're still able to like get away with it. And again, like when it came to the audiences, they were none the wiser. They just like kept thinking, well, maybe some people speak like that in those days. It's like,
yeah. Well, I mean, it does have roots in British,
well,
like
yeah,
the
well, a lot of the
et
English
cetera.
language, like, well, actually, technically, like, where we stand with the language now is that while English like would or could have been Germanic and all that, it definitely got a little bit more. Um, I can't think of the word right now, but basically, there was a lot more influences once William of Normandy took over in England. So French basically had a little influence on English as well.
Yeah.
Changed how that
I'll,
up.
I'll I'll save any further discussion about the. I don't call it a hammer cross. I call it a spear cross. I know Dave calls it the hammer cross, but there's nothing hammer about that. If
Yeah,
that thing comes down on you, it's piercing. And I know because I idly, stupidly leaned into it with force once. Uh,
yeah, I remember that.
yeah. So anyway, I mean, it didn't pierce anything. It was just kind of like, oh well, I won't do that again.
He's like,
But
that's
in any case, I'll save that for that weapon. Will be a specific episode because that's a weapon for the ages. But rounding back, of course, to our tournament show that we did, and just to keep in relevance to the weapons that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Nekote, cat's claw. Of course, I remember, because in that episode, I mean, I wish we had more shots of certain angles, but again, that's neither here nor there. Everything was sort of guerrilla, sort of spur of the moment. But I used it mainly as a means of first keeping distance between my opponent and I, because I took a lot of wide swings that you might see in the festival that we do.
Yeah.
We had that moment that was filmed, which is not going to be in the demo reel that I've already prepared them, and I've sent those to you guys already. You've seen them. But in the original cut, which I could recut, but it's neither here nor there. Of course, there's a moment where I dip it into a vial, right? I've got a leather pouch, I've got a medieval glass and vial, and we just had water and food coloring, right?
Yeah.
Just something obvious to the viewers to be like, hey, that's kind of nefarious and possibly poisonous, as you might expect of a nekote or a takugagi or bagnak or bear claws, tiger claws, etc. that we're talking about. And at first, I come up like some weird vampire thing, and we're gonna discuss real quickly the mask. But and then I just used a lot of wide gaping slashes at her, which is not really how you'd use the nekote, but I think I kind of thought of it more as, because she was unarmed, so something more as I have a weapon, you don't. Keeping her back. I pushed her into a tree. I kicked her in the chest, and then immediately grabbed her by the throat with my open hand, the hand without any weapons, offhand, I will say, sorry, and then used that to immediately slash her, and then I just got out of dodge, and then of course the rest of the video is just her dealing with the poison.
Yeah. Which in that regard, I would say the funny thing about that, that I was, because you mentioned like the process of like, grabbing like the throat with the open hand and then like, slashing across the face and all that. One thing that's always funny to me, like when it comes to our fight stuff and all that, is some people like will point out, I mean, in our case, because we're veterans and we are skilled with what we do, we often point out like, why didn't you do this or anything like that? If you could do that, anything like that.
Yeah, like example, I would have. I mean, obviously, I used it exactly as it should in the last part of it, where you just have a quick slash, just do what you need to do, scratch them, get out of the way.
Yeah.
Today, I'm a very sort of in measure, kind of very brutal fighter. I like having those hand-to-hand matches. I would have and added a little bit of gore to it, right? Because we had like a little drop of blood, but really that's it. I would have stuck it in her, like, because it'll bend. Like that magic trick with the thumb, kind of looks like you're peeling the thumb off.
Yeah.
When you bend the knuckle of the ring finger, it looks like that actual claw part is missing. It looks like your finger is stuck out and the claw part is missing. So you could easily, and I would have done this, I would have made it look like I just stuck it and dug it into her and really just showcase that. But again, I probably won't use these again. Maybe someone else could. But to that example.
Yeah.
You were saying.
But yeah, and then, because yeah, again, like things like those and all that, perfect, like definitely like really great for like on camera stuff or something like that. But I think even like the smallest things that are easy to catch on camera, there's always ways to still portray that even like within the theater of the round and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the point of like dipping like, a small weapon into like, poison or like, poison pouch or anything like that.
Yeah.
That, an easy way to display that, like if it was something that was done like on the chessboard or anything like that, because that's something I'd be interested in seeing, is if somebody's using like some kind of hidden weapon, whether it's bear claws, your weapons, or like maybe even something else, that where basically like they're looking like they're getting their butt handed to them or something like that, and the other person is letting their ego get the better of them. They're just getting the crowd riled up for their victory, and any ongoing person that's looking and actually noticing what the other person who's down on the ground is doing, seeing like how like they slow, or like that they kind of like not necessarily slow, but basically a little bit of an exaggerated slow movement of like dipping or like putting their finger like in something, or like the weapon in something real quick, and then like bringing it out just a little bit and seeing something.
Even just not to but even just like when I did, and then of course we learn along the way. I never should have worn so much leather, the Bible thing, because I used a leather book as well when I was a preacher as a weapon. I should have just had someone hand it to me. Last couple shows is what I did, even if it's just showing one side to the audience.
Yeah.
So one side knows what's going on, the other side might not. There's a whole wide range of things. But real quick, because I've got you here, and we'll discuss it in Helms. We both used what is called, at least the product known as, a draconic helm.
Yeah.
I used in Cressy here. Now it's made of leather. It's just simple leather. It's in no way, shape, or form historical. Although there are very fantastical looking medieval armor that we've even discussed on the show during the suggestive armor episode, and then onward. And we will again, but yeah, no, this was, I used in a feature fight a quote unquote medieval helm made of leather, which covers your face and has this weird scale armor look to it in the back, hence draconic helm, in a fight with Tina, because very specifically in our choreo, before I was even using it, because I hadn't gotten it yet, she has just a throwaway flab of chainmail, right? Like you would have cloth, and she's like, I don't know who suggested it first. I think I suggested hitting me with it, but she thought about using it as a weapon, because we were gonna do a hog tie with it.
Yeah.
But I'm like, yeah, no, just hit me with it. Like literally hit me in the face with. It was like 3 feet of and 1.5 feet wide of just chainmail link, and like just right across the face. And so I'm like, yeah, no, I got a helm coming. I don't know why, 'cause she was our, historical
Historical
costume, gal, and a fabric historian for the show, and did a great job. She's very, very strict, but sometimes some things do get through, like my medieval helm at the time. This was a couple years before you used it. But in that fight, I wish we did better. I wish I did better, not necessarily us, the two of us, Tina and I. I wish I did better, but that was my first fight, right? Your first fight's kind of always a little, oh, what's this?
That's pretty.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. That's pretty much my fights basically, or that was like my first fight too, like with Dean.
What?
It's something
it's not out of the realm of reality, but fast forward a couple years. That year, sorry, I used it. I wore it from opening gate to closing gate. You, of course, a couple years forward, used it just to walk around in. But I remember, and before you talk about it, just a little funny side note. When you came to the back wearing it, obviously it's recognizable, right? Because it's a kind of a one-of-a-kind helm. Anytime they sold it at a booth, people would come up to me and be like, oh, hey, they're selling the mask you wore, or hey, I saw a kid wearing the mask you wore. And then you come back, and I don't care, because it's a common medieval product. It really don't matter. But everyone was like, oh, wait a minute, isn't that NC's? Did he lend that to you? Or Tina's like, what the hell? Who told you could wear that? And it's like, who told me who could wear mine, Tina? But
that was the funny thing when I did come back again with that. I was just like, that's not historically accurate. Who told you to wear that? And then pretty much as you said, it's like, who told me to wear mine?
But anywho, so that of course was our lingering discussion about the concept of tiger claws in both medieval history as well as practical use, from the Bagnak, Takokagi, even the shinobi weapons. It's been fun to talk, and that is pretty much it for this episode. I am, of course, NC. Been talking with my guest here.
Yep, Zach, and it's definitely was a pleasure, and I definitely look forward to doing a couple more if need be.
But that is it, and we will see you next time on the Talk Past podcast.
Take care.